What's up guys, welcome to our tutorial for the month of April. In this one we're going to be talking about how to draw characters from literally any perspective. My initial idea was to do a study session, of trying to draw fun perspectives for characters, but then halfway through I realized with the techniques that we're going to talk about today, you could draw any character from any perspective, and I'm not exaggerating. So what inspired me to really want to work on this topic is that I've realized that most of my work involves a shot of a character where they're kind of like flat. You know what I mean? It's like the way you're looking at me right now. It's like a flat focal plane. There's no distortion. There's no weird perspectives going from top down or bottom up. And whenever I see drawings that involve these very intricate perspectives for characters, I find myself so much more intrigued by the visual composition. I also find myself more impressed by just the way they're drawn. And I thought to myself, why isn't this something that I do more of? So this is something that I've been wanting to learn for a bit. And I want to take you guys on this journey with me to try to learn to draw characters in strange, unusual, very dynamic perspectives. I would definitely consider this topic to be an advanced topic. It's going to require a little bit of knowledge of perspective, general anatomy and proportions and such, but I'm going to try to go through it as simply as possible so that even if you are a beginner, you can still get very valuable information out of this video to add to your repertoire of skills. Just before we dive into our characters, I want to give you guys a bit of a refresh on perspective. Perspective tends to be a very underrated topic. Nobody likes to talk about it because it reminds us of math, but it is very important. So we've got three types of perspective: 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point. The names are very self-explanatory. 1 point means that there is a singular vanishing point and all parallel lines will flow into that vanishing point. 2 point perspective, just as the name says, has two vanishing points. So all of these parallel edges will flow into the corresponding vanishing points. 3 point perspective is the most dynamic option of the three. You can really get some very distorted wide angle looks with 3 point perspective. It will involve three vanishing points. So all these parallel edges flow into each individual vanishing point. So if we have a cube that looks something like this, it would have one vanishing point because only these edges are being pulled towards that singular point. Now, if we take this same cube and we just rotate it 45 degrees, now we're going to get a cube that's being viewed in a 2 point perspective because these edges are now going towards the same vanishing point, and these edges are also going towards the same vanishing point. Now, if we want to make this even more dynamic, we take out these edges and we make them shrink down towards a singular vanishing point. So now you've got all of these parallel edges running towards each individual vanishing point. That's about the simplest explanation I can give. You can apply the same concept to cylinders as well, and this is going to really come in handy for drawing limbs. For example, if you have a foreshortened limb, you're going to see a cylinder that's kind of really distorted in perspective like that, right? Whereas if you're looking at the limb from a straight on angle, you might see a cylinder that's a lot less distorted. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Very, very useful. And just to wrap up this theory portion so that we can get into the demonstrations, I've got 3 key points that I want you to pay attention to when you're doing these studies with me. Number 1, perspective. You got to understand the perspective that you're looking at. Let's say, for example, I extend my arm out to you like this. Now my hand is very large, my forearm looks very large, and it shrinks gradually as you get towards my torso. The same thing happens if I were to extend my arm out backwards. See, it gets smaller. So that's part of the perspective that you want to pay attention to. Another part of the perspective when it comes to drawing people is understanding the angle from which you're viewing them. So for example, look at me right now. My shoulders are about square to you. But if you were to, let's say, view me from this angle, now see my shoulders, there's a huge slant right there, right? Same thing happens if you were to view me from this angle, see the slant of my shoulders, there's a different perspective. And as we get to the end of this video and do some demos on faces, you're going to see that the same thing applies to faces. So if you look at me right now, I'm looking at you square, and this eye line is flat, right? That's the perspective that we're seeing. Now, if I were to tilt my head like this, my eye line is slanted. That's a different perspective. If I were to do this, now my eye line's running in a different direction as well. That's point number 1. You'll see a lot of this as we get into the demos. Okay, perspective, got to keep that in mind. Point number 2 is distortion. Now, distortion and perspective are very closely tied together, but distortion mostly comes from distance to the viewer. So you saw what happened just now. Look at the size of my head versus the size of my hand. Okay, there's no distortion here. This is the size of my face versus the size of my hand. Now, if I were to extend my hand out closer to you, look at the size of my hand versus the size of my head. That's what we call distortion. So as I get closer to the camera, things start to get larger. Same thing's gonna happen if I lean into the camera, my head is gonna look larger, like that. And the same concept occurs vice versa. So if I were to lean back, now my head looks smaller. So that's what we call distortion. That's something else that you want to pay attention to. And my example here that I've given is that with two equal length cylinders, if you were to view them from this angle, now this cylinder is going to appear a lot longer and this one's going to appear a lot shorter. And at the same time, this surface is going to appear much larger and that one's going to appear much smaller. This is all due to point number one, which is perspective, right? Things are vanishing towards a singular vanishing point. All right, so that's point number two. Now let's go on to number three, which is coverage. This is as simple as it sounds. It's basically just paying attention to what part of the body covers which other part of the body. Let's do an example here. If you're looking at me square on, my face, my head is not covering any part of my body. But if I were to have a bit of a lean, say I bow down to you, now look at my chin, right? Half of my face is covering this part of my body. So the shoulder line starts here instead of here. Now that's very important because that informs us of the pose of the character. Say I were to do something like this. Now my shoulder is up and it's covering part of my jaw. That coverage is important because it shows us that this shoulder is raised, because in a normal pose, you wouldn't see any of that coverage. And as we get into facial features, the same thing's also going to apply. So if I were to, say, for example, look up like this, now my nose is going to cover my nose ridge. You're not going to see that ridge anymore because all you're going to see is the bottom side of my nose. So those are the three things that we're going to be on the lookout for today as we go through our demonstrations. Now I want to begin these examples by doing some full body studies just so you can get a nice clear look at how perspective, distortion, and coverage affects the view of your character. So I'm going to go through them one by one. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the first example just so we can really nail down this concept. So this is drawn from that reference. Now, what do we notice here? Well, that reference doesn't have any crazy dynamic perspective. It's mostly flat. It's kind of like just a straight on camera setup. So we've determined that it's a square on perspective, which means there's going to be less distortion. You're going to be seeing all of the proportions of the body, okay? There are some key proportions to keep in mind here. I'm going to give you guys a quick note of them. This might change from person to person, but usually if you just take a character's head, you should be able to fit 8 of them in the length of their body. Again, people can be taller, people can be shorter, so that does change, but just a general rule. Another really great measurement to keep in mind when there is no distortion is that about halfway down the body, you're gonna get the hips. You're gonna get the hip joints. Again, this is gonna vary from person to person, but use this as your general guide, okay? So this is without any distortion. The body divides into a nice half. But now I want to go through these two examples with you because these things will change. So in this reference, we have a camera that is angled upwards. We're looking up at this character. And now all of a sudden we can see the bottom triangle of the jaw. And if we measure the length of the head, you're going to notice that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and maybe 11. So in comparison to the length of the body, the head has now shrunken down. That is distortion due to perspective. Let's take a look at this reference down here. Now, if we just calculate the length of the head in comparison to the body, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 and a bit. Whereas on the normal body, you're getting a full 8 heads. Now, this all occurs because of perspective. This one is being viewed top down, so the head is closer to the viewer. The head is closer to the camera. It's gonna look bigger. Now let's draw a box, okay? Let's draw a box in her place. If we were to draw a box to indicate the perspective here, it would be tapering downwards like so. You're gonna get a vanishing point below. All of these lines are gonna be converging down, whereas that same box will be converging upwards for this piece right here. Now with some of that distortion in mind, let's begin our demo with the bottom up perspective. So whenever I'm drawing these characters, doesn't matter what perspective they're in, I always try to use the head as an anchor point. Okay, so this is the first thing that I put down, and I mark down this triangle for the bottom side of the jaw. That indicates to me the perspective that we're viewing the head from. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is draw the eye line across. So when you have a character who is looking upwards, you'll see that the eye line curves over like so. the eye line curves over like so. A character who's looking square forward, the eye line is relatively straight. A character who's looking downwards, the eye line curves down. The eye line curves down. Okay, there's just something to keep in mind as you're drawing these characters. And as you watch this video, please feel free to follow along with me by using the references that I've provided you. It'll help you absorb the information a lot better by actively following along. Okay, so here's the head, a very simplified shape. We're going to keep it simple like that. Now, the next thing that I always do is find the angle of the shoulders and the angle of the hips, as well as the angle of the spine. Okay, so these things are going to inform me of the general pose of the character. Let's get that angle of the spine. The hips are relatively square, so they're going to be kind of flat like so. So now let's draw a neck down like so. Let's connect the shoulders right there, and let's draw in a simple shape for the upper torso and a reverse version of that shape for the lower torso here containing the hips. And let's draw two simple hip joints inside of a bowl, and that gives us the bottom of the pelvis. All right, I'm going to mark down the belly button because I think it's helpful to anchor the direction of the torso. So I'm going to mark that down right there. And usually for female characters, I think it's good to mark down where the chest peaks. So here in this case, I feel like it peaks somewhere around there. So I'm going to mark that down with a simple curve. Again, we're breaking down these shapes into nice, simple shapes. And just under that peak, you're going to get a rounded curve like so. So something like that, okay? It's very geometric, but you don't have to do as much detail as I am in these geometric shapes. Now, as we get to the bottom half of this perspective, this is what tends to trip a lot of people up. So look at the measurements that we've got here now. We've got the top of the head, we've got the pelvis, and usually in an undistorted perspective, you're gonna get the same equal length, but we are drawing a distorted perspective, which means since our camera is closer to the bottom half of the body and further away from the top of the body, the bottom half is going to appear larger, it's going to appear longer, and that is distortion. So now I can confidently bring this line all the way down here. See, this one's a lot shorter in comparison to the length of this one, and now that will give me the point where the feet will sit. So now coming down here, let's add in a cylinder shape for the thigh. Usually I just do a tapering cylinder shape when I'm drawing limbs, just like that. Very simple. You can add in the muscles and the clothing later, but I always like to start off with the big shapes and then work down from there. So let's get that thigh in there. Now, the kneecap is usually about halfway between the pelvis and the ankle, so just beware of that measurement. Drawing this nice tapering shape for the calf like so, just marking down the kneecap. And then we get down to the ankle, and there is the foot. Now you can connect some of these lines and iron out some of your shapes a little bit, just like so. And now let's move on to the other leg. It's gonna go backwards. And you can also look for the relationship between these kneecaps. This is something I do a lot when I'm drawing characters. This kneecap's a little bit higher. And then this calf, this back calf, is gonna come down like so. The ankle here is a little bit higher because the foot is actually raised. So let's get that in there. Let me just make this a little bit larger to exaggerate that distortion, the closeness to the camera, just like so. All right, and there we go. Now you see we've got a very nice distorted looking perspective of a camera that's looking up at a character, right? And I'm gonna just accentuate that a little bit here by making the foot even larger because again, it's closer to the camera. So what really sells this perspective versus this piece on the left is that we've distorted the head, it's smaller. We've distorted the upper torso, it's smaller. We've made the legs longer. Something else you're gonna notice a lot is the peak of the chest right here. It's really shifted its position. Now before, this area would be quite visible and the bottom side less so visible. But if you're viewing from the bottom up, the bottom side becomes a lot more visible and the top side shrinks. It's like if you were to take a flat plane like this and tilt it up like that. Now you see less of it compared to before. That same thing is happening to these planes on the chest right here. Now for me, I usually like to go from the head down to the toes, and then I would start adding the arms because I feel like the arms are a little bit less consequential in most poses. So here are some simple cylinder shapes for the arms. Make sure that the elbows are in the right places. And there we have the hands, all right? So here's our first example of bottom up. Okay, now let's do an example of top down. Top down is going to be the same concept, but we're going to get a little bit more coverage, which is the third point that I told you guys to look out for. So feel free to follow along with me here. Now we're going to start off again with the anchor point of the head. The head here, I'm actually making it a lot larger now, as you can see. The reason for that is because it's closer to the viewer, it's closer to the camera. There's going to be distortion on this head. It's going to appear larger than it actually is if you were to view the character from straight on. So here is the head, and notice how I've curved this eye line at the front, right? Curve it down and then back up. Now this is where you're going to start noticing coverage. So if you were to draw your neck like this and your shoulders down like that, now you've got a character who's kind of going like this, right? Looking down. That's not what we want. That's not accurate to our pose, right? This is where you really got to pay attention to how much coverage there is and how this shape kind of digs in to that shape of the torso, right? So the shoulders come up like so, and you can see they're almost intersecting with that eye line. That's the coverage we want to pay attention to. You see, the moment you get that shoulder line up there in the right position, you're immediately selling this perspective of looking at the character from top to bottom. Now we're going to do the same thing as before. We're going to find the angle between these two shoulders, as we always do, just like so. And now we're going to come down here and start adding in the basic shape for the torso. Now, remember that when you're viewing a character from top down, things are going to look bigger and they're going to converge on a singular vanishing point. So they're going to get smaller as they get further away from you. I'm going to try to follow the same shapes as before. Okay, so get the peak of the chest. Now, because we're viewing top down, you're also going to see a lot less of the bottom side of the chest. Next up, let's find the angle of the hips. And this looks like it's going in the other direction, presumably because she is walking. So let's get that shape here for the bottom half of the torso. Now there's going to be the bottom of the pelvis, drawing a nice round bowl shape for the pelvis with some joints here for the legs. Just like that. And now plot the belly button down just so you know the center of the body, like so. And there you go. Now you've got the torso. So now I want you to take a look at the top of the head. We're going to move it down, right? We're going to pay attention to the length here. If you measure that distance here on the reference, you're going to see that this length is quite long. And then as you get down here to the point of the toes, this length is a lot shorter. But if you were to pay attention to also the back leg, you can see this length is even shorter. So that's what we're looking for. That's the distortion we're looking for. You might be used to drawing your characters with normal proportions, but capturing these dynamic perspectives requires you to really start breaking these rules. And I think that's what makes it so much fun. So I'm going to bring this line down just a little bit shorter than the one above. Okay, so I'm going to do something like that. And now at about above the halfway point, we can get the kneecap just like so. And now you can kind of clean some of this up, flesh out your anatomy a little bit more. And the other leg is even further back. So once we've established this thigh here, let's just bring the other thigh backwards like so. If you connect the kneecaps here, you can see there's a pretty steep angle here between the two. So that other kneecap's going to be probably somewhere back there. And you're going to see that sometimes I draw these curves on the front side of the limbs. And this is just to remind myself of the cylindrical shape of these elements. Now, once we have these kneecaps, okay, let's just bring the calf down as well, just like so. Let's get some of these rings on there. And then at the very front, you're going to get the ankle and the foot. Now, going backwards to the back leg, this calf is going to be a lot more foreshortened. You're going to see a lot less of it. And you're also going to see a lot less of the other foot. Right, so now you see by paying attention to these distorted elements, paying attention to the coverage of these different elements, we've been able to do a pretty convincing job at drawing a top-down angle, right? This top half is longer, this bottom half is smaller, it's shorter, and now, you can just add in the arms. We're not paying too much attention to the arms right now because they're not super consequential to the pose. So let's just draw the arms down like so. Let's get another one. Right there. Okay, and now you've got a top-down angle for the same character. Here's a little piece of advice. Okay, if you're having a lot of trouble visualizing these different perspectives, I recommend using a box. I know it's crazy. Sam's talking about using boxes, but hear me out. If you just can't get a grasp on how these lines are vanishing downwards, why not place a box at the feet of this character? Okay, and try to use that vanishing point to draw these lines up. Just go from that point and draw these lines upwards and try to contain this character within the shape of this box, right? And once you've established this box, you can see the perspective a lot better. You know, this is why a lot of artists do use boxes to draw humans. Not because the box is a good shape for the base of the human body. It really never is. You shouldn't use a box for organic shapes on the body. But the box comes in very handy when you need it for perspective. Remember, it's like simplifying things. It's hard to visualize how perspective is acting on all of these different elements facing different angles. But if you simplify this whole figure into the shape of a box, if you just put them into a box, this perspective becomes so much more easy to understand. So if you're having trouble with that, try to draw a box over the character, see if you can pinpoint that perspective that this character is in. So if you're following along with me right now, I've got another example here for you. This is your homework. You can pause this video in just a second and try that method out for yourself. Remember, a couple things to look out for: the perspective that's affecting these characters, right? This is a bottom up, this is a top down. Vanishing point is going to be down here. This one, the vanishing point is going to be up above. Remember the distortion, okay? So things that are further away, the upper torso here is going to be shorter. Things that are closer to you, this is going to be longer, okay? So remember that when you're practicing. And then for this piece down here, you're going to get more distortion, larger upper torso, shorter legs. Always establish the angles between the shoulders, the angles between the hips, the angles between the knees, and always be on the lookout for points of coverage. For example, the chin here is blocking the back view of that shoulder. So you can pause this video right now and try that out for yourself. It's definitely not an easy exercise. It's going to be pretty challenging, so take your time with it. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that on our female body, you can see that we've really established this peak of the chest. Now, that same peak on the male body is just going to be right here, right below the pecs, okay? That's going to be the peak, so you're going to get a shape that looks something like that. It's essentially just a smaller version of the female chest, and it's always good to establish the center line, which is the belly button, okay? So there you go. You guys can use this example that I've drawn here as a base. This is going to be a much less distorted version than what you're going to see here and here, okay? So give these two references a shot, and then we can move on to our next demonstrations. All right, now we're back. I hope you actually did the exercise and didn't just continue watching this video. I would be very disappointed if you did. But you see, these concepts of perspective, distortion, and coverage don't always end up being mild examples like this one and this one. Sometimes you're going to get a lot more distortion, a lot more coverage, a much steeper angle of view. And I want to have you guys covered for all of these different scenarios as well. Okay, so let's do a more challenging angle. Now, just as I would approach any other pose, I start off with the head, which is the anchor point for this entire piece. So this is going to be the back of the head. Now, one thing that I'm noticing already is that the shoulders are covering a lot of the head. So you're getting coverage here in that direction. And the angle of the shoulders is not a very steep angle here. So let's just draw that in, not a very steep angle, which then is going to come down into the shape of the torso. And there's that line for the back of the spine. Now, right away, I'm also noticing that there is coverage here with the hips, right? You're not seeing the full extent, the full length of the upper torso. Instead, the glute is actually covering some of that. So that's yet another piece of coverage that we have to pay attention to. Now, that's going to give us the shape of the hip, and it's going to appear much larger than the upper torso because of that very strong distortion. So let's get the shape of this hip in here like so. It's a reverse of the upper torso shape, and we're going to get the angle of the hips, okay? And that's going to give us the joints in the legs. So that pretty much gives us the shape of the upper torso. I know it looks very weird right now. This is not what you would typically expect a torso to look like, but it's weird because we're seeing it from a weird perspective. Now, speaking of a weird perspective, it's going to give you weird distortion as well. So this is the length of the upper torso. Now, if we were to compare this length to the length of this lower torso, you can see there's a huge difference. I would say the lower torso would extend probably all the way down here, and we'll have to shrink our drawing down just a little bit to accommodate that. Now, starting from this glute, we're going to get the cylinder shape of the thigh, and notice the angle that it's coming down at. So it's a very dynamic pose. The leg's kind of kicking out in this direction, so let's get that cylinder in there. And I would say the kneecap is a little bit above the halfway point. Since the foot and the calf are so close to the camera, they're going to appear a lot larger. We're going to get a lot more distortion. It's just like if I were to raise my hand up and put it really close to the camera. Now, once we've established that knee joint, let's bring this cylinder shape right down like so. Let's get some of these curved lines in here just to indicate the three-dimensionality of that shape. Now let's move on down towards the kneecap and towards the calf. What's surprising here is that the calf is going to look almost the same width as the thigh, which normally in an undistorted perspective, that would not be the case. But here it definitely does appear a lot larger simply because it is closer to the camera. Now let's get this foot down here, get some of that anatomy on there, right? Get some of the calf muscles just like so. That's going to be the bottom side of the sole. So there you go. Let's get rid of some of these construction lines. Let's add in some of these anatomical features of the muscles here, just like that, right? That looks great. Now we can kind of clean up our anatomy a little bit, clean up these shapes up top, just clean up some of these lines like so. Let's bring that down. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is work on the other leg. So this other leg, it's going to be kicking forward. Right, so this kneecap is going to be above this kneecap, and you're going to see less distortion in this leg, but much more in the calf. So a little bit of distortion there. I think that's fine. I'm just going to bring this out a bit. Right, there's the muscle, there's the other side. Now that's going to be the kneecap, and then we're going to notice the position of the foot. The position of the foot is right about there where this knee is going to be. Okay, so let's get the back of that heel. Let's get this shape of the bottom of the shoe, just like so. And just above this foot, you're going to get a very, very foreshortened version of that calf. It's almost not visible. So just like that, you've got the other shoe. I feel like I might have made it too long. No problem. Let's just liquefy that, bring that up like so. And let's just clean up the anatomy here a little bit, right? Clean up some of these lines just like so. Now you've got the torso, you've got the legs, and you've got a very, very dynamic looking pose in a crazy perspective. I'm gonna add a little bit of shading here just to ground the pose a bit. Now, the next thing I wanna do is move on to the arms. So the arms are very simple. Get that shoulder joint, get that cylinder, pay attention to where it's foreshortened and where it's not foreshortened. This arm is going to be swinging in front and this arm swinging backwards. And there's the hand in a very strange position. But there you go. Now you've got a crazy dynamic running pose, right? Again, paying attention to all of those elements. We've got a bottom up kind of perspective, right? If you were viewing a box, it would look very much distorted, something like that. And we've also got some crazy changes to the proportions of the body. So the bottom half is so much longer than the top half, and you're also getting a lot of coverage from both the hips and the top of the shoulders. Now here's a top-down pose that's even more exaggerated. Why don't we give this a shot? Now you can see right off the bat, the head is huge, right? And this is all due to the perspective and the distortion, right? You can immediately tell that this reference is being viewed from a top-down angle and everything is vanishing towards a vanishing point that's at the bottom. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're drawing this character. I'm gonna shrink this head down just a tiny bit, and we're gonna get the angle of the shoulders. So once again, pay attention to that coverage because you're viewing the character from the top down. Part of the shoulders is gonna be blocked by this bottom half of the jaw. Okay, so just like so, the shoulders are angled like that. So you see this entire part of the jaw kind of cuts in to the shape of that upper torso, right? Remember to pay attention to that coverage. Now, the next thing we're gonna do is we're just gonna try to find the general angle of this pose. We're gonna try to bring this torso down like so. This is gonna be the upper torso, and that's gonna connect to the lower torso, which there's gonna be a little bit of coverage here of the hips, right? You're not seeing the entirety of the hips. So here's the upper torso. Here's the lower torso. Now, if the upper torso is being viewed from a top-down angle, you're gonna see a lot less of the lower torso. So pay attention to that coverage, right? And let's get the hips like so, just behind the shape of that upper torso. Now, pay attention to the angle of the hips. Draw a line up like so. It's pretty close to what you might find for the shoulders, but it is a little bit less steep. So let's just apply the hip joints right there. Gonna add in the shape for the belly button just to indicate the center of the torso, and let's add in the peak for the chest. That's going to give us a shape that kind of juts out like so. There you go. There you've got the shape of the chest. And if you've been following along with me so far, we've got a shape for the upper torso, right? Quite simple as long as you remember to factor in all of these different elements covering each other. So now let's pay attention to the length of the torso. Okay, so here's the top of the head. Bring that line down. There's the end of the upper torso. Bring that line down even further. There's the end of the bottom of the body. So there's a huge amount of distortion here in terms of the length of the body. So let's take that knowledge here. Let's bring this line down. There's going to be the bottom of the hips right there. That's going to be the end of the bottom half of the body. So let's expand this out a bit. And let's begin with the leg that's in front. So let's draw in this leg like so, remembering that this will be the very bottom of the body. Okay, so there's going to be the kneecap, the legs kind of coming forward. We're going to draw some curved lines on the front to indicate that three-dimensional shape. Now I'm going to clean up the silhouette a little bit, clean up the anatomy just a little bit, just like so. And now we're going to get the other leg just behind it. So this kneecap is a little bit higher up and this leg is going to be a little bit straighter. So you see a little bit less of it, just like that. Okay, so now we have the two thighs, and then just below this front thigh, you're going to get barely a visible portion of the calf, and right below that, right, highly foreshortened, we're going to get the foot. Now the foot is going to be a lot smaller than if it were to be viewed from a normal undistorted angle, because again, this is very far from you, very far from the camera. So there's that foot. Now let's draw in the other calf, just like so, and is the other foot. Now I feel like we can probably bring this head up even more, make this even bigger, just to add to that sense of distortion, right? Now let's bring the shoulders out and start adding the silhouette for the arms. There's gonna be a lot of distortion here as well, right? Look, that's where the elbow is, that's where the shoulder is. So you're barely seeing any of the side of this cylinder. There's gonna be the elbow, and then right down here, there's gonna be the forearm. There goes the hands, the thumb, the fingers. That's one arm, and the other arm is barely visible. So let's just draw in the hand here, and there you go. Now you've got a pretty convincing look at a top-down perspective. Let me just clean up some of these lines here. You know, once you've been able to establish a solid base like this, you'll be able to start adding more stuff on top, like costumes, you know, musculature, for example. Now, one thing, when you're drawing these poses, when you're doing these exercises, don't be too discouraged if you find them looking weird. They're supposed to look kind of weird. These perspectives are definitely far from the usual thing that we see. So your brain's gonna be like, I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be extending the leg out like this. I shouldn't be extending out the upper torso like this, but just go against that instinct for a little bit and just try to go about it a little bit more logically, right? Paying attention to the lengths of the body, the distortion, the coverage, and all that. Now, I just want to show you guys a way that you could use this knowledge in your own work. So say, for example, we have a character like this, okay, who's leaning downwards, looking at you. Now, there's not too much distortion other than the foreshortening of the upper torso. And there's a little bit of coverage for the shoulders, and there's the upper torso plus the lower torso, which is the hips. But once you start to really understand this, okay, once you start to really get a grasp of these perspectives and how they work, you can really play around with it. Let's say, for example, I want to make this even more exaggerated. I want to make it look like the camera's going right up against this character. Well, now I can just expand the size of that upper torso, come up here, expand the size of the head, like that. Let's expand the shoulders, like so. And now let's take maybe the bottom, let's expand that out a little bit too. Not that much. I mean, I guess we could, but let's just pull that back a little bit, expand that out, expand that, make it a little bit larger. And maybe we can shrink the hips, which are a little bit further away from us. And now it looks as though we've put this character into a fisheye perspective, right? You've got that crazy distortion at the top, you've got more distortion at the bottom, and things in the center seem super far away from you. So you look like you've taken this shot on a super wide angle lens. So that's the kind of cool experimentation you can do once you start to understand these perspectives. And I feel like a lot of the artists that I look up to, when I see a piece that looks like this, that's exactly what they're doing. They're just pushing and pulling these proportions, creating that distortion, and making a pose that would have otherwise been kind of flat look much more dynamic, closer to the camera. That does it for the body section. Now let's talk about faces. I'm sure you guys want to put faces on these characters that you're drawing in these wild dynamic poses and perspectives. So let's talk about some things to look out for there when you're drawing faces, okay? What do we need to pay attention to? Well, the same three concepts actually apply. Again, this is going to require you to know a little bit of the basic dimensions of the faces. So here's a face that's in a 3/4 view, but it's relatively square in terms of perspective. You're not getting any distortion here of the upper or lower portions of the face. You can see the eye line, you can see the brow, the forehead, the nose, and the chin all match up relatively closely to 3 equal thirds, which is great. That's the measurement that we want. And that is the undistorted measurement, okay? And another really good measurement that I like to pay attention to when I'm drawing characters that are, in strange perspectives like this or like this is the measurement of that eye line. So here the eye line is flat, right? Flat. There's no distortion in this eye line, so it's almost perfectly halfway between the top and the bottom of the head. Granted, this guy has a longer chin, but you get what I mean. Now, what happens when we view a head from the bottom up, like we did in some of our previous body examples? Well, see, this happens. The two key things I always look for to determine that perspective are, number one, the eye line, this curve of the eye line. If that eye line is curving this way, in a bit of a frown, the head is looking up. If the eye line is curving downwards in a smile, the head is looking down. Very simple, okay? And there are no exceptions to that rule because the eye line always wraps around your face in a semicircle. Now, in this perspective, we're going to notice distortion. Usually what you're going to see with heads is that the eye line is just about halfway across the middle of the head, okay? So that you're going to get half up here, half down here. But when you're viewing the head from bottom up, see how the eye line moves up like that, okay? Now you're getting a lot less of the upper half and a lot more of the lower half, just like how it was in the body drawings. It's the exact same concept, but it's transferred onto different shapes. So it really isn't that complex once you understand these basic perspective fundamentals. The second key thing I look for when I try to determine the angle of the head is this shape right here. See this triangle shape at the bottom of the jaw? If you can see that triangle at all, you're seeing the head from a bottom-up angle. If you can't see that triangle, then you're probably looking at the face from a normal perspective. In this case, we do see that angle, so that means the face is facing upwards. Now let's take a look at a face that's facing down. Look at this eye line. So what's happening here is the exact opposite of this, right? In this example, the bottom half of the face below the eye line is longer. In this example, the top half of the head from the eye line all the way up to the top of the head, this is going to be longer. So the nose and the mouth from the eye line down are going to be really compressed. And in some cases, you might get the nose covering part of the lips. That's where you find coverage. Now, I want you guys to follow along with me here and observe this series of references and see how the perspective is directly affecting the way the facial features look. So let's begin with a straight-on perspective. The eye line here drawn across the inner corners of the eyes is just about halfway between the top and the bottom of the head. Okay, so there's no distortion there. That's normal. Now, as we move the camera upwards, notice what happens here. So now the top of the head is here, and where do we find the eye line? Well, it's all the way down here. And you can see just below that, now there is the chin. Okay, so now all of a sudden this proportion has completely changed. Now everything from the eye line and below is almost only 1/3 of the length of the entire head. When we move over to this side, as you can see, when the camera pans down, you're starting to see more and more of this triangle shape under the jaw. Okay, always pay attention to the visibility of this shape. As you go all the way down, you can see this triangle becomes very, very visible. You'll also notice that the jawline goes from a V shape in the normal angle to a slightly reversed V shape in the bottom up angle. So if I'm drawing a head that is facing me, I'm going to remember that the eye line is about halfway. There's going to be no distortion. The ears are also going to be relatively aligned with the top of that eye line. So here we're going to get the eyes. Remember that the space in between the eyes is going to be about the length of one single eye. Okay, so here you're going to get the eyes. Now you can get the hairline in there, get that brow line in there, divide it into 3/3, and you can get the positioning of the nose, the positioning of the eyebrows, the positioning of the mouth just above the halfway point here between the nose and the chin. This is how you draw a normal face. Now, if you want to draw this face in an angle that's facing upwards, now you got to pay attention to this triangle just below the jaw, like so, okay? So we're going to just shade this in so you guys can see it better. There's that triangle. Now from this triangle, we're going to get the same shape for the face, and then we're going to get an eye line that's cutting much closer to the top of the head. So from this eye line, I'm going to draw our eyes, right? We're just going to follow the curve of that eye line. There's going to be our eyes. As soon as you get these eyes, things become a lot easier. Now, one thing that I think can help you a lot in terms of visualization for how these perspectives change is if you draw a triangle between the pupils and the tip of the nose, it's going to look like that. Now, if you were to take the head and you tilt it up, this triangle is going to look a lot flatter. Okay, so the tip of the nose and the pupils, they start getting closer and closer to a singular line. Okay, and you're gonna see that on the examples here in the reference. Let's take this one, for example, no distortion. There is that shape for the triangle. Now, if you were to draw the same triangle on this face, look at the difference here. It's almost completely flat. So that's just perspective. If you take a triangle like that and you face it towards you, you're gonna see less of that surface, just like that. I find that's a very helpful way to visualize it. So if you draw that same triangle here, you wanna put the tip of the nose really close, right there, right? And now, from that tip, you can draw in the bottom, the nostrils, just like that. From here, you can place the mouth up towards the top. Now the mouth is gonna appear a lot higher because the chin is the closest thing to the camera, so it's gonna appear larger. There's the mouth. We're gonna just shade it very lightly to show the difference between the top and the bottom lip. And above the eyes, you're gonna get the brow line. And just above that, you're gonna get the forehead, right? And once you fill out the shape of the head, the ears, you're gonna notice they're gonna be all the way down here, right? Because the ears are kind of like an anchor point. When you move your head up, the ears don't really move. But in relation to all your facial features, they now appear lower. Whereas if you move your head down, the ear also doesn't move, but in relation to your facial features, they appear higher. So the ear is another very important element that you want to get right when you're drawing these perspectives for your faces. Okay, so now bring it down. We've got the neck. And once you're happy with this, you can add in some colors for the hair, flesh out that sketch a little bit, and now you've got a character looking up. Okay, now let's give these examples a shot here. Okay, so the bottom one here is going to be slightly slanted. Let's get that triangular shape for the bottom of the jaw, like so. Bring the shape of the face down. I'm gonna just shade in the bottom of this jaw very gently and bring the cranium back a little bit more. Now on the side, you're gonna see that the ears are quite low on this angle, right? So the ear is gonna be right about there. That really gives us a nice anchor point. Now the eye line is gonna be really close to the top, just like so. We can get the eyes on here. Paying attention to that distance between the two eyes. We're gonna get the irises. And again, we'll pay attention to the triangle. So the tip of the nose and the pupils. Now what you're gonna notice is that we're viewing this face from such a steep angle that this triangle has actually reversed. We're seeing the underside of that triangle now. So what that tells us is that from this angle, the nose is gonna poke out a little bit. So the tip of the nose will be all the way up here. And going back to the point of coverage, well, the tip of this nose is actually going to cover a lot of that nose bridge. You won't be able to see much of that bridge. And when you guys are drawing this, you're probably going to be like, this is the weirdest thing that I've ever drawn. This doesn't feel right. And that's how it's supposed to feel. Okay, it's not supposed to feel right. It's basically going against all of your intuitions on what a face should look like. Now, just above that, add in the eyebrows, kind of following the same angle as the eye line. And just below the nose, we're going to add the mouth. Now, when you're viewing the face from below, the mouth always seems to be in a frown. That's because it wraps around the front curve of the face. And this plane has a nice curvature to it, and the mouth goes a little bit off of that front side. So there's the corners. Let's add in some shading for the upper lip and a bit of shading on the lower lip, okay? Now let's bring the chin up a little bit more. I'm gonna chip out the jawline here and just add in the taper for the neck, just like that. And now you've got a head looking up, right? Very, very strange looking angle, and it's hard to make this angle look good, but boy, is it fun to draw. So let's get the hairline here. Let's get the forehead here. And now you can start adding in some details like the hair, right? Just fleshing it out a little bit. Add in the hair right there. Let's shade the bottom of the nose, shade the bottom of the brow ridge. Let's get some more shading on the bottom of the jaw, just like so. And there you go. There is bottom up. Again, very challenging angle, very weird looking angle. It's probably one of the most difficult things to draw when it comes to drawing faces. Now let's try it at a 3/4 angle, but still bottom up. So now let's get that center line there. Now pay attention to the angle of that eye line, right? It's coming up like so and still very close to the forehead. So that eye line is gonna wrap around this shape, just like that. We're gonna get that same shape for the jawline. A nice triangle going back to the neck, just like so. Now let's shade in this triangle, give it some depth. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come down here and add in the shape of the neck, like that, okay? Now I'm gonna bring this jawline upwards, add in the shape of that ear. Now from this eye line, I can add in the shape of the eye, as well as the shape of the other eye. Now you won't see as much of the other eye because there's a little bit of coverage from the nose. So remember that trick that I taught you guys? Okay, find the pupil and then find the tip of the nose. So in this drawing, it's gonna look like, again, a reverse triangle like that, right? So if we connect the dots here and bring the nose up here, that should be the right way to draw this face. Again, very, very counterintuitive, very strange. But if you just follow these observations, it should get you good results. Shade the bottom side of that nose, bring that bridge up a little bit. You don't see much of it because of that coverage. Bring the eyebrows up like that. Now you see we're starting to get a good read on this perspective. Let's bring the cheek out a little bit, just following the shape of the face like so. Now let's add in the mouth just like that, and some shading for the upper lip, some shading for the lower lip, just like that. Right, so as you guys can see, just pay attention to a few very key things and you can very effectively capture one of these strange perspectives. So from here, you can start adding in some of the hair. Again, very, very weird looking. Looks like a bit of a thumb. I'm gonna add just a little bit of shading here for the jaw, for the neck, give it a bit of depth. Get some shading just under the brow ridge, like so. And there you go, there's another strange perspective. Now you can feel free to add these faces to the previous body drawings that we've done. And here I'll just round this video off with some final examples of a head looking down. Now, kind of the same concept, right? We start with the cranium, we find that center line, bring the face down, get the jawline like so, and now let's get the eye line, which is gonna be closer to the bottom, right? So you're gonna see more of the top of the head, less of the bottom of the head. This is a 3/4 view, so you're getting a slightly more challenging perspective. Now the ear is gonna look a little bit higher, so that's where it's gonna be. That's the anchor point for the ear, and we're gonna come down and we're gonna just draw in the neck right here. Very simple, right? Now from this point, you're gonna notice that depending on the person, sometimes their brow is going to cover part of the eyes because you're viewing from a top-down angle. This doesn't really happen with the Asian people because we don't have as deep of a brow ridge. But here you can definitely see that it is occurring. So the brow is going to intersect with the eye. It's gonna cover part of the eye. That's a little bit of coverage there for you, right? So part of that eye is gonna be covered. Now on this side, part of this eye will also be covered. Let's get that brow right there. And now the bottom of the nose is going to appear a lot lower than it would on a normal square looking face. Reason being, again, because it's closer to us, things closer to us in perspective appear larger. So this nose is going to appear a little bit longer than you would normally expect to see it. And you also don't see the nostrils because you're looking top down. So there's the nose, right? And just below that, I'm gonna get the mouth. There is almost a little bit of coverage here, but not quite. So there's the mouth right there. There's the shape for the bottom lip, shape for the top lip. Let's get that chin right there. Get the shape of that cheekbone. And there you go. Now you've got a nice top-down angle, right? Always pay attention to the angle of the eye line. Always pay attention to this curve, to the angle that it's going in. And when you first look at any reference, always try to observe the top half versus the bottom half. How much of each do you see? So this one's a bit more of an extreme example, but we can still use that same concept. So let's take that round shape for the top of the head. Now bring this down. Let's get the shape of the jaw. So the eye line is going to be at this kind of an angle and quite low on the face. It's going to come down like so, wrap it around just like that. There's the front of our eye line, and now we can bring the center line all the way down to the tip of the chin, just like that. And you can see this head already starts to appear like it's in perspective. Now let's focus a little bit on the jawline here and add in the placement for the ear. All right, that's another anchor point for us. So there's going to be the neck, there's going to be the back. Now there's going to be a little bit of coverage with the shoulder. And this point indicates, just kind of the positioning of the body. It shows you the pose. That's an important piece of coverage to pay attention to. So right off the bat, we've got a really good read on the perspectives here. Let's draw in the hairline here. Let's try to find the eyes. So the eyes are looking downwards, which means they're going to be curved downwards. The eyes are going to look like this, curving down. These eyes are going to look like this, curving down. Now, you're also going to see there's a tiny bit of coverage with the brow ridge. So the brows start right about there, and the other set of brows start right about there. So the brow line and the eye line almost seem to merge in this perspective. Now, as you exit from that brow line, you're going to see that the ridge of your nose comes down like so, and there's the point. There's the tip of your nose, the triangle. There's going to be a little bit of coverage between the nose and the mouth. Just like that. Okay, so there's going to be the lips. Now I'm going to just shrink the chin down a little bit because I've probably made it too large. So there you go. Now let's add some shading for the lips there. Let's add some shading under the eyes. I'm going to work on the shape of the head a little bit here. Just bring the ear back in a little bit more as well. And there you go. There's another top-down perspective for the face. So I definitely recommend taking your time with these. They're all quite challenging. Okay, be patient with yourself. This is for sure a more advanced tutorial, so don't try to rush it. But with that being said, hopefully some of the things that I talked about in this video can help you out when it comes to drawing your characters in unique and dynamic perspectives. I'm going to give you guys a package of references that I found on Pinterest for you guys to practice. And if you want to draw a pose but you just can't find it, remember that you can always use yourself as a reference, right? Just take out your phone, you can set it on 0.5 and do some crazy angles with yourself, and you can see the same effect as we've shown in this video. Anyways, with that being said, I just want to say thank you so much for being here, for being part of this community. I couldn't do any of what I do without you, so for that, I appreciate you a lot. I hope this video has been helpful to you, and with that being said, I'll see you guys on the next tutorial video.